All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. This is our first of our three-part lecture series entitled We Are Still Here, an Indigenous History of the United States. And glad that you're here. Hopefully you'll get to learn things this evening that maybe you don't know or that you haven't heard before. May even hear some things that disturb you a little bit, and I think that's a good thing if they do. If our disturbance actually results in transformation and change. And that's what this lecture series is all about. So before we get started, I'll just announce, in case you didn't know, that we do have some finger food. We have some fruits and vegetables and some nuts and other sweets, so feel free at any point in the lecture to avail yourself of them. And if we can, it's currently 10 after 6, so what I'd like to do is lecture until about 7:15 or 7:10, lecture for an hour, and then have a 5-minute break to make sure your blood's pumping, and then we will transition to a time of discussion. So if you have any questions, please reserve your questions until the end. That way we make sure we cover all the material. Okay, so as we begin, let me make this disclaimer, a little introduction about the series. This series seeks to explore the history, and by the way, if you're sitting over here and you can't see the slide, please feel free to move to where you can see it. This series seeks to explore the history of the United States' relationship with indigenous peoples in general, and the specific role of the Euro-Christian settlers in particular. The objective is to encourage steps towards reparative justice through understanding. Has anyone, I know there's several of you who've heard this presentation before, or at least prior year iterations of it, but is there anyone that's not heard the term reparative justice? Raise your hand. All right, we've got some people for whom this is a new concept. So unfortunately, we will wait until our third lecture to really do a deep dive in reparative justice as well as a theology of place, but it becomes the backdrop for the reason that we give this lecture series. Okay, just looking forward, an outline. Today, September 4th, we're going to look at from Cahokia to colonization. Now, this spans a time period of roughly 3000 BC until around 1790 or 1800. So we have a lot of territory to cover in this hour that we're together. And then next time, not next Thursday, because we will not meet next Thursday, but the following Thursday, September the 18th, we'll look at attempted annihilation and assimilation. That goes roughly from the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, until the 1970s. And then on week 3, September the 25th, we'll look at from ashes to resurgence, the role of reparative justice and the theology of place. We'll look at from the 1970s all the way till today. And hopefully you'll have a good overview of what we present today and on the 18th and on the 25th all weaves together to create the context in which we do ministry. And so we'll define in greater detail reparative justice and also talk about a theology of place, which is the philosophical foundation for the ministry of Woodlands Gathering. Okay, so this series does not claim to be representative of all indigenous peoples. Such a claim would be impossible. I can't speak for others. Rather, it is an attempt to tell the story of the United States through the lens of a shared experience in an effort to better understand today's indigenous peoples. So just very briefly, I'll locate my own self in this story, my story. I'm from both settler and native ancestry. This is a picture of my paternal grandmother, Alfreda May Edwards, both when she was a young girl as well as shortly before she passed away. She passed away in 2016. She was full native, and both of her parents were native. Her mother was Choctaw and her father was Cherokee, but they identified or affiliated with the Western Cherokee Nation. Since I was a young boy, I felt called to Native ministry and I'm currently the pastor and planter of Woodlands Gathering, which is a church with the vision of being a safe place for Native Americans and all people to encounter the good news of God. All right, that locates me in this story. Now let's go way back prior to what we call the Columbian contact, or prior to 1492, and look at the Americas of antiquity. The pre-Columbian American tribes had no concept of nation. So today we refer to what is the part of North America, the United States, and we say that we are a sovereign nation. Well, prior to 1492, no native tribe had a concept of nation. In fact, this is a concept that originates in Western Europe. It originates from the Euro-Christian context, and it's something that was imported. And so whenever we continue our journey, there are terms that are used, particularly in dealing with both the colonial governments as well as Native American tribes, and then even into the 20th and 21st century, dealing with the U.S. government and sovereign Native nations that were coined or developed after contact or after colonization. They were not indigenous. They were not understood by the indigenous population prior to 1492. Each village was sovereign. What that means is that even though you have all various tribes, in fact, currently in the United States alone, there are more than 575 federally recognized tribes. And even though you had several tribes, each village within a tribe had what we would now identify as sovereignty, because they had their own independence. They were related to other villages either by intermarriage, by the clan system, and I'll give the example for the Cherokee people. There are 7 clans, and if you came from one of those 7 clans and you lived in one village, someone who was in another village of the same clan, even if you never met them, was your family. They were your relative. And so it was a taboo, and still is, for those who are traditionalists to marry within your clan. So clan lineage was always determined by the mother. Cherokee people, in fact, most southeastern tribes have been a matrilineal people, meaning that the women determined the clan into which someone was born. And also the women owned, for the most part, owned the house. So when a man would get married, he would move in with his wife and with her family. And if something happened that, it wasn't a good relationship, well, he's the one who had to leave, and the wife had got to stay because the property, so to speak, was owned by the women. That being said, there was no notion or idea of private land ownership. To own land, and this is very important for our discussion, to own land was not something that Native people ever thought was possible. And really, it is a bit irrational to think that any human being could own a piece of real estate or land. The concept of private property, of course, when it comes to land, originated in Western Europe. And in order for someone to own a piece of property, or for property to be real estate in Western Europe, it had to be, if it was common property, if it had no prior stake or no prior lien on that property, then it had to be built on or developed or improved upon, is the language that is used by those who were seeking to possess it. And so this idea of private land ownership was really a novel concept. It was not something that was indigenous to the worldview of indigenous North Americans or South Americans or Central Americans for that part. So frequently throughout this lecture, I'll talk about North Americans, and I'll try my best to identify, at least from the colonial period onward, the United States. Of course, we know that Canada is also included with North America, and Mexico is with Central America and South America. So many of the things that pertain to what is now the United States and the tribes residing in the geographical boundaries of the U.S. are also true of tribes living in Canada and Central America and South America as well. All right, so early indigenous society, what was it like? Well, harmony was a tribal virtue. So the greatest good that Native people aspired to obtain was harmony, to live in a harmonious way with your neighbor, to live in a harmonious way with creation, with the entirety of the community of creation, not only with the people, but also with the land itself and with the animals that you share the space with, was one of the highest virtues. And one of the greatest vices was any sin that was committed against the community. Native people are very communal, very corporate-oriented as opposed to individualistic, and harmony was a tribal. In fact, it may have been the greatest, the most significant tribal virtue if we were looking at it in terms of prioritization. Land is not something you live on, but it's something you live with. So for early indigenous people, land, again, owning land was not even a concept that they would have entertained as a possibility. In fact, this led to a lot of the disagreements and a lot of the conflict with some of the early colonists because when the early settlers sought to purchase land directly from Native Americans, the native people thought, well, how could they possibly be wanting to acquire the land? You can't hold on to it. You can't possess it. Surely what they want is hunting rights. And so what many of them understood to be selling were hunting rights. And then, it led to skirmishes and it led to fighting whenever they wanted to share those hunting rights because, after all, they'd been hunting on that property or farming on that property for millennia prior to the settlers arriving there. The land mass in North America was an intricate system of roads, connected communities, really throughout the entirety of North and South America. In fact, you can see that from archaeological digs that there was significant trade between South American tribes and North American tribes. We find artifacts, we find drawing, we find certain shells that would have originated along the western coast all the way over in the eastern seaboard. And so there was this intricate web of trade, an intricate web of communication that existed between tribes both within North America as well as South America. All right, some of the values of Native America that are still values within indigenous societies today are community-oriented. This is opposed to being individualistic-oriented. Creation-oriented, holistic. So you wouldn't think of compartmentalizing an individual. If someone was sick, it was not uncommon for someone to have practices that involved both what we now know as medicine, such as the use of plants, the use of herbs, as well as prayers and songs that would be administered for the sake of the healing of the individual, because people were not treated as simply bodies, but they were treated holistically. There was no sacred and secular split, no spiritual, no physical in traditional Native society. And in many indigenous languages, there is no neuter form. There is no neuter pronoun, which created a lot of miscommunication and confusion whenever some of the early missionaries would come over and try to understand Native religions, because in the Native vocabulary, everything in creation is a person, is a being, is someone with whom you share life with. And so they would talk about the rocks as the rock people, and the sky as the sky people, and even the thunder as the thunder people. And this had to do really with a holistic view, worldview, as well as the fact that there are simply not neuter pronouns in many of the indigenous languages. Native society was story-focused instead of fact-based. So stories became the repositories of Native virtue, Native values, and also of Native histories. Some of the stories that were told among tribes, for anthropologists and historians today, are very insightful and seem to have been passed down from generation to generation, dating all the way back possibly even to the most recent Ice Age. Relational responsibility. So whereas in our own society we talk about rights, in fact, rights are something that we really talk a lot about and we celebrate in the United States. We say that in fact, our Constitution, which we'll talk more about here in a moment, says that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, in the indigenous worldview, you cannot talk about rights with also talking about responsibility, particularly the responsibility between peoples or between nations or between relationships. So relational responsibility had equal value, if not greater value, than an individual's rights. Native societies are past-present oriented instead of future-oriented. I don't know if you realize this, but much of Western civilization thinks a lot about the future. In fact, as a church planter, one of the first things I had to do, and I think there's value in it, I'm not knocking it by any means, but one of the first things I had to do was come up with a 5-year plan. And that plan was from 2020 to 2025, and this year I actually created another 5-year plan that would begin in 26 and go all the way to 2030. So as a society, we are very future-oriented. And by the way, that has affected the questions that we ask when it comes to our faith as well. For many people, salvation is reduced to simply something that you can enjoy in the afterlife, whether you go to heaven or you go to hell, instead of seeing salvation as having any direct bearing on how we live out our life in the present world. For the indigenous people, what mattered was the here and now and the past. So Native people were both present and past-oriented instead of future-oriented. I've already commented on the value of harmony, but the harmony ethic is the prevailing ethos of the community, that to live in harmony with all of creation was of utmost importance. Most Native societies are egalitarian, not hierarchical, and that is not only in relationships between genders, it's also relationships between family members, relationships between, to some extent, humans and animals. Very egalitarian. There is no sense in which man is superior within creation, but simply has a relational distinction within creation. And I've already mentioned that most southeastern tribes, at least, and also plains tribes and northern tribes were matrilineal as opposed to patrilineal. All right, early indigenous society. So early societies subsisted on corn, beans, and squash. In fact, many of the food sources that we know today and that we love and celebrate, tomatoes, did not originate in Italy. They originated in North America. Sugar, many of the things that we consume today and are consumed all over the world were originated in North America. So some of the staple diets were staple products of the early indigenous diet were corn, beans, squash, deer, elk, and bison, as well as fish. Trade in beads, furs, and pottery was very lucrative, and clothing was made from cotton and animal skins. Now, this is something I'm told by several indigenous elders, both within my own tribe as well as others, that prior to 1492, disease was nearly non-existent. It didn't mean that disease didn't exist. It meant that for every disease that people encountered, there was a known remedy. There was a known plant that would address that. David Wade Chambers, who in his book, Native American Road Systems and Trails, gives us some light on the connectivity between indigenous communities when he says the first thing to note about the early Native American roads is that they were not just trails used for hunting. Rather, they constituted an extensive system of roadways that spanned the Americas, making possible short, medium, and long-distance travel. All right, early indigenous society was comprised of houses that were made from materials taken from the local environment. So when I said earlier that harmony was a very important virtue and value of indigenous society, we see that harmony not only between human beings, but also in what you use to build your houses. The houses were different. A lot of people think that all Native Americans lived in teepees, and that simply isn't the case. A teepee was a mobile home for a Native American, and were more characteristic of the Great Plains tribes than of the southeastern tribes, because they used them in order to follow the buffalo herds during the hunting seasons. The early Cherokee homes, which most of the people who lived in this area, in the state, which what's now the state of Tennessee, were the Cherokee. Early Cherokee homes were made of wattle and daub construction, which is a bunch of sticks that are closely knit together, and then a source of mud, maybe mixed with sand, perhaps clay, is laid on top of that until it hardens. These would be winter homes. The summer homes would be built very similar in a similar shape, but they would be left open to allow for cross ventilation. And when it came to social decision making, I said earlier that the Cherokee in particular and most southeastern tribes were matrilineal. And so every clan, there were 7 clans, there are 7 clans among the Cherokee, and every clan would have a clan mother. That clan mother was very important. The clan mother, along with the beloved woman, which is a distinction of honor within Cherokee society, as well as the beloved man. But the beloved women, as well as the clan mothers, were the ones that ultimately had the ability to elect or veto a chief. And there were 2 chiefs that served, one that served, a white chief that served, called a white chief, that served in time of peace and prosperity, and then a red chief, which served in a time of war. And if either one of them made a decision that the clan mothers didn't like, they had veto power. But when they came together in council, if any large decision had to be made, then consensus was the means of making that decision. So today it's majority rules. In a democratic society like the United States, 51% wins the day. But in traditional Cherokee society, traditional Native society, consensus was the means of making decisions. All right, now let's talk briefly about major metropolitan communities. By the way, did you know that there were major metropolitan communities in what is now the United States, dating back, according to some archaeologists, all the way to 9000 BC? Did you know that? One example is Cahokia. I grew up not far from Cahokia. Cahokia is located in Illinois, just east of the Mississippi River on the other side of St. Louis. It is a large, in fact, if you've never been, I encourage you. Has anyone been to Cahokia besides my family and I? Okay. I encourage you to go if you're ever west of the Mississippi, or I guess east of the Mississippi, because it's right before you cross the bridge into Missouri. It is a phenomenal remains. It is the site of probably the largest metropolitan area in North America prior to colonization. At its height, the height of the metropolis was 1050 AD. Cahokia had a population of more than 20,000 people, and I want you to compare that to places such as London and Rome. London had a population of 15,000 at the time, and Rome of 30,000. So picture a metropolitan area in the heart of what is now the United States, and having as bustling and influential of a city as Rome itself in the 1st century AD, or the 10th century AD. Here are some locations of other mounds, other cities that existed that have been uncovered by archaeologists, and you'll just note that some of these, a lot of these are along the Mississippi River, which is why that entire civilization is known as the Mississippian culture or civilization. But the approximate dates of each of these sites is given there on the map. One in particular that I'll point out is Poverty Point, which most people have heard of. 1400 BC is when it was originally inhabited. And so all along the Mississippi, we see not a world that is vacant, not pristine wilderness that had never been inhabited, but rather a continent that's been inhabited for millennia by a thriving and self-evolving and harmonic civilization. Other major metropolitan communities are Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, Chichen Itza, Poverty Point. I usually ask this as a question, but I've already put it up there, so I'm not going to act like you don't know. But if I were to ask you how many people lived in what is now the United States in 1491, most of you probably would have given me a very small number. I love to ask that question, and I'm fascinated. I ask it of first graders and all the way up to people who are college educated. And sometimes the first graders actually give me a more accurate number than people who are college educated. But usually when I ask that question, people say, 150,000. Or they may say 1 million. But the conservative estimate, which means that there were probably more, but we're just being conservative, is that in 1491 there were 60 million people who inhabited what is now the United States. 60 million indigenous people. By the way, how many native people do you think inhabited what is now the United States in 1891, just 400 years later? 250,000. So then it begs the question, which is something that we're going to explore in this three-part lecture series, why? What happened? How do you go from 60 million people in 1491 to roughly 250,000 in 1891? And let me just give you some brief insight. It wasn't accidental, and even though some of it was due to the widespread of new diseases that were unknown to the North American continent, not all of it was. All right, so Charles Mann, who wrote a book entitled 1491, which I commend to you if you're interested, talks about the continent of North America, what it was like prior to colonization. And in the pre-colonial American continent, there was a harmonious display of what is known as silviculture. It's a hard word for me to say. Silviculture. Anyone heard of silviculture? Nope. Silviculture is a type of agroforestry that combines trees with livestock grazing and forage production. According to most historical first-hand accounts, when some of the earliest colonists, as early as the 15th and 16th centuries, came to the eastern seaboard, they did not find dense forest like you see today. If you were to go even looking here behind the church, you see a very dense wooded area. Well, most of that foliage is not indigenous to North America. Most of it is invasive plants that have been imported from other countries. But what the early colonists saw were what appeared to be manicured forests. And in some cases, they said that there was enough space between the trees to even drive a wagon through without your wheels being caught up in the debris. So, and the reason why is because indigenous North Americans for millennia had been practicing silviculture, which is a type of agroforestry that combines trees with livestock grazing and forage production. In other words, most of the North American continent was one large, intentional, harmonic farm. And it wasn't domesticated, but it was definitely intentional. And we see this today because out west, there's been all these wildfires in California, and finally, many of the scientists are catching wind to the fact that the native population have been intentionally setting fires for millennia prior to colonization. And the reason why they did that was that it would, as long as you had controlled burns, those controlled burns would actually prevent an excess of foliage that was combustible that would later become a fire that would be out of control. But Charles Mann says this in his book, 1491. He says, rather than the thick, unbroken, monumental snarl of trees imagined by Thoreau and the great eastern forest, by Thoreau, the great eastern forest was an ecological kaleidoscope of garden plots, blackberry brambles, pine barrens, and spacious groves of chestnuts, hickories, and oak. Francis Jennings, another historian who wrote in the 20th century, said that European explorers and invaders discovered an inhabited land, not an empty land. Sarah Augustine wrote a book entitled The Land is Not Empty, or The Land is Not Empty, and I commend that book to you as well. She talks about the damaging impact of something we'll identify here in just a moment, known as the doctrine of discovery. But she reiterates what has been passed down and what is now known and documented by historians, that this was not an uninhabited wilderness. This was not a vacant promised land. This was not a land without a people looking for a people without a land. It was a heavily populated continent that ultimately was cared for in a harmonic way for millennia before Columbus was ever lost at sea. Had it been a pristine wilderness, then it would possibly be so still today, for neither the technology nor the social organization of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries had the capacity to maintain of its own resources outpost colonies thousands of miles from home. Incapable of conquering true wilderness, the Europeans were highly competent in the skill of conquering other people, and that is what they did. They did not settle a virgin land, they invaded and displaced a resident population. By the way, that may sound harsh if you're not familiar with this version of history. Usually when I do this lecture series, I begin by saying that there's no such thing as history. There are histories. And usually the victors are the ones who write the history. And the version of history that I am sharing with you this evening is probably not a version that you've heard before, because it was not taught in schools. And in fact, most history now is not taught in schools, but definitely not the history that I'm teaching this evening. But the fact that Francis Jennings says that the colonists did not settle a virgin land, they invaded and displaced a resident population, that is key for understanding where we are going really throughout the course of this lecture series. Okay, looking back at Charles Mann, again in his book 1491, he says this: until Columbus, Indians were a keystone species in most of the hemisphere, most of the Western Hemisphere. Annually burning undergrowth, clearing and replanting forests, building canals and raising fields, hunting bison and netting salmon, growing maize, manioc. Native Americans have been managing their environment for thousands of years. As Cahokia shows, and by the way, the reason why the Cahokia was abandoned is because there's a couple reasons, according to both history as well as archaeologists. One is that the leader became a little too powerful because of concentration of authority all in one location. But also there was the stories that are still existent today that are told among the Cherokee people and other tribes, that there was a time when humanity forgot the value of being harmonious. And so mankind here on the North American continent began to kill more animals than they needed. They began to exploit creation and use it in a very selfish way. And as a consequence, in fact, there's a story told about the origin of diseases in Cherokee culture, where the animals get together and they've been, they had this harmonic relationship between man, and they said, as long as you treat us kindly, as long as you don't take more than you need, as long as you use all of our body parts and kill us in an honorable way and kill us with a grateful heart, we'll be willing to die and feed you. And the story goes on that when man forgot that relationship and began to kill more than they needed and left their carcasses to rot in the sun, that ultimately the animals called a council, and they said, what are we going to do? We know we'll put disease on man. And at that council, every animal known to man on the North American continent was present. The people who were not present were the plants. And so the story goes that the animals actually created disease, and man began to die in mass. And they cried out to Creator, and they said, help us. And Creator, of course, felt sorry for his creation. And so he began to show them dreams of different plants that they could use in order to bring healing to them. And that was what restored the balance or the harmony between man and creation. But that story is told to illustrate what historians are beginning to realize, which is that at Cahokia, mistakes were made when it came to, being selfish, being greedy. And it took the decline and the abandonment of that civilization in order to restore the harmony and balance that is so treasured among indigenous peoples. By and large, Charles Mann says, they modified their landscapes in stable, supple, resilient ways. All right, so that takes us from prehistory all the way to the 15th century and what is known as conquest, the time of the age of conquest. So how did Christopher Columbus, who sailed the ocean blue in 1492, how did he evaluate the people that he encountered? Well, these are his own words. This is taken from his journal. These people are actually a letter that he sent to, I believe, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. These people are very simple as regards the use of arms. As your highnesses will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken, to bring home and learn our language and return. Unless your highnesses should order them all to be brought to Castile, or to be kept as captives on the same island. For with 50 men, they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. In fact, there's a story that is told that the reason why the native people are called Indians is not because Christopher Columbus thought he had reached the West Indies, like a lot of people think, but rather Christopher Columbus spoke the Latin language, being a good Catholic, and when he saw this population of people, he described them as Indios, which in Latin means in God, or a godly population. So definitely he encountered a population which was not hostile. It was very hospitable. a population that, according to him, could be subjugated, and made to do whatever is required of them. Why would he have that worldview? As we enter the age of conquest, what was the impetus, what was the driving force behind the early conquistadors and the early explorers, the early colonizers, to treat their subjects, to treat the people who basically inhabited and lived and occupied the countries that they discovered? What was it that caused them to treat them as if they were subhuman, as if they could simply be conquered and claimed for their crown? Well, it's actually a theological doctrine, which is why this is a lecture, a discussion that takes place in the context of a church and by someone who is not only of mixed heritage but also a minister. Because the impetus, the foundation for why this could happen is known as the doctrine of discovery. One cannot understand the motives behind the period of early American colonization apart from the critical theology known as the doctrine of discovery. This belief, ingrained within the Western European world, considered all lands uninhabited by Euro-Christians as being at the disposal of the European monarchs, and at their discretion they could be claimed and sold. One of the articles, one of the documents of this doctrine is known as Dum Diversas. It was written in 1452 by Pope Nicholas V, and this is what he authorized the explorers to do. We grant you by these present documents with our apostolic authority. So again, apostolic authority, sanctioned by the church and blessed by God, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens, that's an Old English word for Muslims, and pagans, and any other unbeliever and enemy of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Now, if anyone is a student of history, you know that in the 15th century, there was this issue of the Crusades, right? The Crusades were sanctioned by the church. The First Crusade was the only crusade that brought both East and West together, basically for the sake of defending Constantinople, which is now present-day Istanbul. But one of the reasons the Crusades were called was because of the encroachment of the Muslims into Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And so not only was the Pope calling the Christian armies to arms against the Muslims, but he was also equipping them with the theological ideology that they would need as explorers to subjugate anyone, not just a Muslim, but anyone who was not a Christian, to the authority of the crown that they represent. Well, this Dum Diversas has its counterpart in the Anglo world because, after all, I'm giving this lecture in English, so that means that the Anglo world, or England, had to be preferred, or at least given special treatment in this endeavor. And we'll see that in the very beginning it was actually a battle between France, England, and Spain. But in 1496, which was only 4 years after Columbus got lost at sea, there was a patent granted to John Cabot and Sons, and this patent gave him the authorization to do the following. The King, to all who come greeting, be it known and made manifest that we have given and granted to our well-beloved John Cabot full and free authority to sail to all ports, regions, and coasts, to find, discover, and investigate whatsoever islands, countries, regions, or provinces, which before this time were unknown to all Christians, and that John may conquer, occupy, and possess whatever such towns, castles, cities, and islands by them thus discovered, that they may be able to conquer, occupy, and possess whatsoever by them is discovered. Again, this became the theological foundation for the explorers and the early colonists to claim American lands, or lands that were are now known as the United States, North America, Central America, and South America. By the way, before I go any further, let me just say as an aside that the doctrine of discovery is not something that's an antiquated doctrine. In fact, the most recent quotation in the courts of law in the Supreme Court of the doctrine of discovery was in 2005. 2015. 2015, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in the Supreme Court case, State of New York versus the Oneida Nation, made the comment that native inhabitants of this country did not have right of ownership of this land because of their uncivilized state, but rather right of occupancy. And it was that basis on which the nation, the Oneida Nation, actually was forced to comply with the laws of the state of New York, even though the Oneida Indian Nation has been sovereign over their own land ever since the 16th century. So we're not talking about antiquated ideologies. We're talking about ideas, beliefs that make up the very foundation of contemporary American private property law. Okay? That needs to be understood before we keep going. So, in the age of colonization, in the age of discovery, we have these theological ideologies such as the doctrine of discovery that provide the impetus needed, the justification for people conquering and claiming lands for the sake of God and for the sake of the crown they represent, inconsiderate of the fact that they were already occupied. In fact, there's a missionary who in South America stands out above all the others. His name was Bartholomew de las Casas. And the reason he stands out is because in the 15th century, I believe, he went to the King of Spain and actually, and it's shameful that I would even have to say this, but actually made the case before the king why the inhabitants of what's now South America actually had souls. And it was on the basis of that argument that he won that missionaries were allowed to continue to come to South America. All right, so let's go back north, and talk about the U.S. So after the age of discovery, after the doctrine of discovery, there came, by the time of the 18th century, 17th century, there was definitely this notion among the 13 colonies of American covenantalism. What is American covenantalism? Well, really, it's the manifestation or reincarnation of the doctrine of discovery. American covenantalism is the belief that the founding fathers and subsequent settlers had a God-ordained right to conquer and displace or replace the land's original inhabitants. And the language that would eventually be used at the end of the 19th or 18th century and on into the 19th century is from sea to shining sea. It persists as the dominant narrative in American history. In fact, everyone who says that America was founded as a Christian nation has bought into, maybe without knowing it, the narrative of American covenantalism. It is the dominant narrative in American history and is the philosophical justification for much of American exceptionalism. What is American exceptionalism? The belief that America has a unique role in the world, a God-given role, one of representing justice, truth, and liberty to all the nations of the world. In the 20th century, that was the justification for many of the wars in which America became involved. The idea that we have a privileged place as a country in the world, and as such, we have a responsibility to fight for the liberties of others. Well, all of this originated from an ideology of American covenantalism. What was American covenantalism? Well, I'm going to give you some examples of it as it was defined by the ministers of some of the early 13 colonies. By the way, in most recent times, American covenantalism has reemerged under a new name of Christian nationalism. In 1620, just before the landing of the Mayflower, smallpox brought by English trading ships spread along the northeastern coast throughout the Pequot communities, resulting in massive deaths. King James, of historic fame because of his commissioning of the English version of the Bible that bears his name, stated that the disease was God's great goodness and bounty towards us as English. By 1640, the English settlers initiated a new attack on the Pequot communities. And according to William Bradford of Pennsylvania fame, He said, those Pequots that escaped the fire, so these, the colonists, early colonists, attacked this group of people, which, by the way, if you go back and you study the very first Thanksgiving, or you study the landing of the Mayflower there at Plymouth Rock, you know that it was the Wampanoag as well as the Pequot tribes that helped some of the early colonists survive the winter. William Bradford, in attacking the Pequots, those who remained, who were spared from a death of smallpox, said, those Pequots that escaped the fire, so basically what was done is they surrounded the village, they brought all the men, women, and children into the middle of the village, and the warriors as well, and then when they were surrounded and unable to flee, they set them all on fire. And in William Bradford's words, those Pequots that escaped the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others run through with their rapiers, so that they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stench and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hand. In 1630, aboard a ship bound for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, a Puritan pastor, preached a sermon in which he stated the following about the early colonies located along the eastern seaboard. He, God, shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all the people are upon us. Now notice what John Winthrop does, and it's actually something that now doesn't seem, ministers all across this country are doing it every Sunday. Now it doesn't seem to be that significant. But at the time, what John Winthrop was doing was actually using language that Christ stated about his church and applying that to a nation, applying it to the colonies of the Massachusetts Bay. We do something very similar almost every 4th of July, or anytime there's a National Day of Prayer, whenever we quote from 2nd Chronicles or 1st Chronicles, and we say, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. We act as if that promise was made to the United States of America. Why? Because deeply ingrained within our psyche, within our ideology, is this notion that somehow America is an exceptional nation. This is not something that we have hidden, by the way. In fact, 2 years ago, when Benjamin Netanyahu was addressing, shortly after the horrible massacre of October the 7th of 2023, Netanyahu was addressing Congress. And when he was addressing Congress, he actually said, your people and our people have something in common. He said, we are both occupying a promised land. I'm talking about 2023. And what was the result of Congress? They stood to their feet in applause. American covenantalism is the very fabric of the narrative of American history. One tragedy of the Euro-Christian myth created to justify the genocidal history of America is the manner in which the true Christ of Scripture has been and continues to be so grossly misrepresented. America is not the promised land. God did not give the 13 colonies the U.S. in the same way that he gave Israel the land of Canaan in ancient times. Mark Charles, who was here a few months ago or last month, said this in his book, Unsettling Truths. He said, the conflation of Old Testament Israel with U.S. history becomes even more troubling with the trajectory of Deuteronomy and the historical narrative in the book of Joshua. Because if the 13 colonies are the new Israel, and if what can be applied, should be applied exclusively to the church is applicable to now this country known as the U.S., then what does that mean for the land's inhabitants? However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he's quoting here from the book of Joshua, do not leave alive anything that breathes, completely destroy them. And before we twist that passage in an ungodly way and think that it has been think that there's no way that it's been used to explain and justify genocide on this continent. Let me remind you once again of the number of people living in the United States in 1491 and the number of native people living in the U.S. in 1891. All right, so we've transitioned from the age of conquest or the age of exploration to the age of colonization, which roughly is 1650 to 1820. Now, in 1650, the estimated colonial population, notice colonial, not the native population, but the estimated colonial population was 49,000. By 1770, a mere 120 years, the number had grown from 49,000 to 2,148,000 people. This was on the very eve of the War of Independence and the founding of the United States. What was this period like from 1650 roughly to 1790 or 1770? There were frequent skirmishes between settlers and tribes located along the eastern seaboard. Frequent land grabs against tribal villages conducted through a scorched earth means of warfare. Scorched earth means that you burn everything in sight so that there are no survivors. That type of warfare did not begin with the USSR. It did not begin with the former Nazi regime. It was a way that the U.S. And the early colonists dealt with the original inhabitants of this country. Numerous disputes over land outside the proclamation line, which I'll talk about in just a moment, were claimed in violation of the treaties between England and native tribes. As the population in the colonies began to grow, the number of people who sought to purchase land directly from Native Americans increased astronomically. Usually when these purchases were made, the deeds that were drawn up were either not disclosed to the native people or they were later embellished to be far larger than they were originally agreed upon. This led to a lot of conflict between the native tribes and the colonists. One Powhatan leader said this. He said, "Why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants. If you will come in a friendly manner and not with swords and guns so as to invade an enemy." Well, during this period of time, there were three major power brokers in the colonial America: France, Spain, and England. And the native tribes, who often became the ping-pong ball that were thrown back and forth between these three world powers. But at the time, most of the native tribes were large enough and powerful enough that they actually were a force to be reckoned with. And so what would happen is whenever the French wanted to partner with the native people in order to use them against England, they would do so. At other times, the tribes such as the Iroquois partnered with England in their war against France. And then Spain, of course, was in the backdrop, eventually disappearing whenever they sold their remaining land to France in 1762. But the French and Indian War spanned the period, also known as the 7 Years' War, spanned the period between 1754 and 1763. It's more accurately known as the 7 Years' War. It was fought between France and England, primarily over the French claims in the Ohio River Valley. So as the population of the colonists increased, the number of people who were flooding into the Ohio River Valley increased as well, and so this led to the conflict of the French and Indian War. During this war, native populations, wary of ever-expanding English settlers, sided with the French. At least some of them did. As I mentioned, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, sided with the English. The Treaty of Paris ended the war in 1763, relinquishing the contested territory to the British. Now, this is what the map looked like. Everything in blue was French claims. Everything in striped red and blue was the disputed territory. And also, if you look to the right of that red and blue striped territory, that would have been the proclamation line of 1763, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But then Spain, of course, owned Florida, and much of the eastern seaboard was owned by the British. So the Treaty of Paris ended the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, in 1763, and in it the French relinquished Canada to England. Spain relinquished Florida to England. England allowed France to keep its West Indian sugar islands, or the Caribbean. England allowed Spain to keep Florida, so they divvied up the land as if, from afar, from Europe, as if it was something that, a piece of pie that they could cut up. The Ohio Valley east of the Mississippi was opened to English encroachment. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was probably, in my humble opinion, the most significant political statement, although it was made royal statement, it was made by a king, that resulted in the American Republic. If it had not been for the Royal Proclamation of 1763, I don't know that the U.S. ever would have declared its independence from Great Britain. So what was at the heart of this proclamation? Well, the proclamation forbade all settlements west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, which was delineated as an Indian reserve. Anything west of that line was an Indian reserve. Anything east of that line was land that was owned by Great Britain. The proclamation created a centralized secretary. So previously, prior to 1763, if you were a colonist, if you were a settler, you could go out. There were four main ways of acquiring land. You could either get it from a land title from the king himself, which you couldn't do unless you were, most of the land titles had already been given out to the colonists, to the people who founded the colonies. Or you could purchase land that was already part of the colony, which was a premium because of the number of colonists that were moving in, the number of settlers. Again, in a 120-year period, you go from 50,000 to 2.1 million. Land is hard to come by. 3, you could buy it outright from an Indian nation, which is what a lot of the settlers did. Or 4, you could just squat on it and hope that your government would back you up if the Indian nation came to try to take back what was theirs. After the Royal Proclamation of 1763, one thing that Britain did was it created a centralized secretary for dealing with Indian nations. In other words, it made it illegal for any individual settler to purchase land from native people. This resulted in, by the way, because of the disputed territory, the area that was striped red and blue that I showed you on the map, which was disputed between France and England, it was also heavily occupied by native tribes from the north all the way to the south. And so in order for Britain to be able to truly establish harmony between those native tribes, France and the colonists, they had to double their army. And as a result of doubling their army, guess what? They wanted the colonists to pay for it. And so in order to pay for this army, which would protect that boundary line, they raised taxes. And if you know anything about American history, you've probably heard of some of these taxes. The Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, all of these were acts that were used as justification by the colonists to attack Britain and to revolt and to declare their independence. The response of the colonists to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the land speculators and their financial stakeholders were enraged because, and I'll talk more about land speculators in just a moment, but the most lucrative business in colonial America was land speculation. What is land speculation? I'll tell you in just a moment. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 may have been, and I said this earlier, the single most significant instigator of the colonial revolt against the king. All right, so this is what it looked like. The dark orange was the territory that would have been Great Britain, the colonies. And then the demarcation line, the proclamation line of 1763 there would have followed the Appalachian Mountains, the Allegheny Mountains up north, the Appalachian down in the south. Anything west of that would have been the Indian Reserve, so land that was supposedly promised to native tribes forever as long as the sun shall shine. And then west of that would have been land that Spain had recently in the Treaty of Paris ceded over to France. And in 1803, France would then sell it to the the newly founded the United States and what is known as the Louisiana Purchase. So during this time, I said that land speculation was the most profitable business. What was land speculation? Land speculation had been bound up with the English colonization of North America from the very beginning, typically from tracts ranging from a few hundred, to a few thousand acres. But beginning in the 1740s, sensing the steady growth of the colonial population, some elite colonists began projecting ways to profit off of colonial expansion on a grander scale, founding a flurry of speculative land companies. By the mid-18th century then, British Americans had developed a settler colonial system for dispossessing native people and apportioning their land into private property. After obtaining an Indian deed, colonists frequently failed to pay the price they had promised, and some purchasers vaguely described the land they sought, swiftly surveying and patenting a much larger tract. In his book, Speculation Nation, Land Mania in the Revolutionary American Republic, which I commend to you if you're interested, excellent book, historian Michael Blackman says this. He said, land mania erupted because white Americans staked the success of the revolution, and this is key. A lot of people think that the American Revolution was fought for, life, liberty, and independence. Well, really the reason the American Revolution was fought was so that the colonists could have equal access to land without having to petition the British Crown. Land mania erupted because white Americans staked the success of the Revolution on the seizure of and sale of land that native people were loath to relinquish and that too few settlers turned out to buy. So what a speculator would do, just to briefly explain, is, and by the way, there were several speculator companies, is they would go out and they would look at land that was owned by native nations, and they would, in fact, there's a story told in this book about how that there was an agreement between some of the colonists and I believe it was one of the native tribes, I forget which one, and the land speculator who was making the agreement said, I will survey the distance of land that I can walk in a day. And whatever that distance is, I'm going to come back, write the number of acreage, and then I'd like to purchase it from you. Well, what he did was not walk, but ran. And so it turned out to be something like 70,000 square acres that he supposedly bought from this native tribe. Well, what did he do? As a speculator, he would take that back and he would present it to many of the land-owning gentry within the colonies, and he would say, look, I have this land, it's virgin land, it's native land, and I'm 70,000 acres, how much do you want to invest? How much, it cost me X number of dollars, I'm willing to take your investment, and if I sell it, then you'll get a portion of the profits. Well, one thing they overestimated was how high in demand that land would be. So many of the settlers actually didn't buy as much land as they had claimed was available, and so it caused them to lose money, caused them to lose profits. And so what they realized was that unless they had the ability to continue to play that game, it's almost like a Ponzi scheme, unless they had the ability to continue to claim land and then try to sell it to people at a much higher price, then they wouldn't make money. So patriot leaders believed that native territory would fund the creation of republican governments and fuel the growth of republican citizenry. Claiming land by conquest or purchasing for the land next to nothing through fraudulent treaties, they intended at first to distribute it directly to white settlers. But those democratic plans collided with some harsh realities. Native nations pushed back to repel the U.S. invasion. There was a fusing of dispossession and speculative finance. Speculators rushed to amass huge land holdings under the expectation that native people would ultimately succumb and that the settler demand that had eluded governments would someday arise. For the new nation born in 1776, then, settler expansion and native dispossession were founding mandates. So, one of the driving forces behind the revolution was access to land. And this is one thing that Michael Blackman says, which I think is very telling. Again, I commend the book to you if you want to take a deeper dive into this information. He says, although American patriots fought a revolution against the British Empire, they were not opposed to British law or the idea of empire itself. In fact, colonists waged a war for independence in part to revive a model of empire that had once served them well. What was that empire? It was a colonial society of Protestant settlers and slaveholders accountable to the interests of its peripheries and rapidly expanding across native lands. Independence, therefore, did not disrupt the general continuity of the law of settlement in British North America. Instead, the revolution would reorient a new nation's political economy around territorial expansion, especially towards the West, using the law of settler colonialism that Americans already carried in hand. Basically, what Blackman is saying is that the land, the ability to acquire land, it becomes one of the driving forces even behind the Declaration of Independence. Because after all, in the early republic, who could vote? All white people? No. All white males? No. Only white males who owned land, right? And so at the very heart of the early American Republic was this quest for land. What would that mean to the land's original inhabitants? Well, as we progress throughout this series, we will find out. Notwithstanding their fair speeches, this is Seneca, Chief, saying Garada. He said, notwithstanding their fair speeches, the rebels, the colonial patriots, wish for nothing more than to extirpate us from the earth, that they may possess our lands, the desire of attaining which we are convinced is the cause, now he was referring to the Revolutionary War, of the present war between the king and his disobedient children. Very few people realize today that the occupation not only was President Washington, George Washington, a surveyor, but he actually worked for and was part of a land speculating company. This comes from Mount Vernon's website itself. As a surveyor, Washington gained an intimate knowledge of Indian country and a small fortune in land. How? By speculation. Surveying represented a respectable profession in the 18th century America and held the promise of social and financial advancement. Over the course of 50 years, Washington completed numerous surveys, many documenting the settlement of the territory along Virginia's western frontier, i.e. land that would have been west of the Proclamation Line of 1763. So by the time the U.S. Declaration of Independence was written, one of the grievances that the early colonists gave to King George III, to the British Crown, was this: he, the king, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That was grievance number 27 that's still in existence today in the Declaration of Independence. Well, we know the way that the war between the colonists and Great Britain turned out. 1776, the United States was born. 1779, General George Washington instructed Major General John Sullivan, when he was fighting native tribes along the western frontier, he instructed him in a letter, and I'm quoting here, lay waste all the settlements around, he's speaking of native settlements, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. You will not by any means listen to any overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effected. Our future security, speaking of the United States, will be in their inability to injure us, and in the terror with which the severity of the chastisement they will receive will inspire them. That was 1779, 3 years after the Declaration of Independence. Well, as you would imagine, the conflict between the early colonists, the settlers, and the native tribes west of the Proclamation Line, which now was meaningless because of the newly minted American Republic. But during this period of time, there were a lot of skirmishes. There was a lot of warfare. And it resulted in one of the first treaties between the United States government and native nations, the Treaty of Hopewell, 1785. Article 5 of that treaty says if any citizen, now this is a promise between the newly founded American Republic, they soon begin to relate to the native inhabitants in a very similar way as did the British Crown prior to the French and Indian War. In the Treaty of Hopewell, they said, if any citizen of the United States or other person not being an Indian shall attempt to settle on any of the lands westward or southward of the said boundary, they drew the boundary at the Blue Ridge Mountains, the U.S. government did, which are hereby allotted to the Indians for their hunting grounds, or having already settled, and will not remove from the same within 6 months after the ratification of this treaty, such persons shall forfeit the protection of the United States, and the Indians may punish him or not as they please. And then Article 13 said, the hatchet shall be forever buried. One of the first treaties between the U.S. government and the native inhabitants. 1785. Well, that was short-lived because in 1788, a settler by the name of John Sevier, who's very well known in the state of Tennessee, in fact, there's a county named after him, and a city, Sevierville, who had previously in 1784 led a group of settlers from North Carolina to the west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, thus creating the independent state of Franklin, ordered an unprovoked preemptive attack in violation of the Hopewell Treaty. Because remember, the Hopewell Treaty was 1785, this is 1788. He led an unprovoked preemptive attack on Cherokee towns, killing 30 villagers. The federal government refused to act, forcing the Cherokee to take matters into their own hands. So at this point, the U.S. is in direct violation of their own treaty. They refuse to act. In the words of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote An Indigenous People's History of the United States, Sevier's actions formed a template for settler-federal relations, with the settlers implementing the federal government's final solution, while the federal government feigned an appearance of limiting settler invasions on indigenous land. And this would, by the way, be the case for the next 50 years. From 1790 roughly until 1830, with the American Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson, the mode of operating between the U.S. government and native nations would be that basically when the settlers would come into territory that was forbidden for them to go into by U.S. treaty, basically the U.S. government would do nothing. And when so many settlers occupied that area that they became, anonymous, then they would send their army to actually defend the settlers by building forts and by making sure that those settlers were protected. This became the mode of westward expansion throughout the most of the 19th century. In 1793, Sevier invaded the Cherokee villages with a stated mission of total destruction. He demanded absolute submission for the remaining Cherokee villages, threatening to wipe them out for good. After waiting a month, 1,750 Franklin Rangers, the state of Franklin, attacked 2 villages, burning the buildings and fields. He wrote, "War will cost the United States." He already assumed the U.S. would back him up, because they did. "Much money and some lives, but it will destroy the existence of your Cherokee people as a nation forever." So, went over by 10 minutes, but I tell you what, we covered a pretty broad spectrum of time, from roughly 3000 BC all the way up to 1790. So we're going to stop there.